U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump held his first campaign rally on Saturday since an attempt on his life. He told a large crowd in an arena in Michigan that he had received a bullet for democracy. Trump was joined at the event by his newly minted partner, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. He, by the way, said, "I have to be honest, it's still a little strange for me to see my name on those signs." Congressman Ronnie Jackson, a former White House doctor, said Saturday that Trump, quote, "is recovering, as expected, from a gunshot wound to the ear." Investigations into the shooter at the rally and security at the event are ongoing. In his first joint interview with Vance, Trump noted that people at his rally last week noticed that someone was on the roof before the assassination attempt. How did someone get to this roof and why was he not reported? Because people saw that he was there. Trump said, talking about the events in Butler, "I would like to add that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had a telephone conversation with U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump this week. The head of our state congratulated the American politician on his nomination from the Republican Party and condemned the shocking assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. He wished Trump strength and absolute security in the future. I noted the vital bipartisan and bicameral support of the United States in defending the freedom and independence of our nation," Zelensky wrote on the social network X. "Ukraine will always be grateful to the United States for its help in strengthening our ability to resist Russian terror. Russian attacks on our cities and villages continue every day. We agreed with President Trump to discuss at a personal meeting what steps can make peace just and truly lasting," Volodymyr Zelensky summed up. And this meeting can really take place. Details are revealed by Volodymyr Zelensky's press secretary Serhiy Nikiforov. According to him, Ukrainian president urged Trump not to believe the representatives of those countries who are trying to explain or justify Putin's actions. It was also about the attack on Mykolaiv, during which Ukrainians were killed again, including, unfortunately, a child. They discussed and condemned the attack on Kiev and Okhmatdit on July 8.
Trump also said a very interesting thing. He said not to believe in fake news, that his election victory could be beneficial to Russia. And indeed, let's say, the agreement in principle of both parties to the meeting was recorded. Certain periods of time were discussed when this meeting should take place, but it is still very, very early to talk about it. It's up to the teams to work and agree on schedules and details whenever possible.
I will also remind you that the day before, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson unveiled the so-called peace plan, which Donald Trump could resort to if he becomes president again. It discussed the next potential steps. The West allows Ukraine to hit airfields on Russian territory with ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles and other weapons. When the aggressor's troops are pushed back, Putin, quote, could offer a deal. Russia is retreating to the borders as of February 24, 2022. The territory of Ukraine controlled by Kiev is recognized as a free country with the prospect of rapid accession to the EU and NATO. After the end of the war, some Ukrainian troops are stationed in European countries to replace part of the 70,000 US troops who were deployed to deter the possible aggression of the Russian Federation. That would supposedly allow Trump to save money, bring US troops home, and force Europeans to do more to protect themselves, which is one of his key goals. These are the goals that Boris Johnson announces. He also says that Russia can then announce that the so-called special military operation, but in fact the war has fulfilled its task and achieved all its goals. For the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, special protection measures are introduced. This is the plan of the former British Prime Minister. It seems that in Ukraine they do not agree with him, which is very, very logical, because Johnson noted that with President Donald Trump in the White House there is a real prospect of a certain global rapprochement with Russia, and with Putin a return to the times when Russia was a respected partner of the G8 and even NATO.
Певного глобального зближення з Росією, а з Путіним повернення до часів, коли Росія була поважним партнером Великої Вісімки і навіть НАТО.
If and when Trump returns to power, he has a huge chance later this year not just to mend his predecessor's legacy, but to lead the world forward. Donald Trump sees a risk. Ukraine's defeat would result in enormous long-term costs for America and the world. On the other hand, a Ukrainian victory, if properly delivered, could pave the way, paradoxically, for a new and much better relationship with Russia. That would be a great victory for America and for the world. I'm not saying it will be easy. It will take away your strength. It takes determination. This will require nerves of steel. In Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump demonstrated that he has the courage to do the job.
You see, on the one hand, Boris Johnson was really a good friend for Ukraine when he came here, when he signed military aid packages from the UK. But on the other hand, Boris Johnson is now literally proposing to allow Russia, that I can't call Russians a society, that all goals have been achieved and that everything is already fine in Ukraine. After that, Russia would supposedly have to be accepted into various alliances, at least into the G7 alliance, which is now the G7, but could potentially turn into the G8. At least that's what Boris Johnson claims. A very ambiguous article. On the one hand, it says that Ukraine needs help. Ukraine needs to be given permission to hit the territory of the Russian Federation with Western weapons. If we are talking about deep distances, about long distances in order to, for example, suppress enemy aircraft. On the other hand, from a political point of view, he suggests that Ukraine agree literally with the fact that after this cynical, bloody and brutal aggression, Russia can again have partners somewhere in the world among the collective West, which, by the way, gives us those weapons and provides us with financial support. So, what is it all for? A rhetorical question that I don't know if Boris Johnson has an answer to. Let's move on to the news from the invaders. On the morning of July 21st, an air raid siren was sounded in the temporarily occupied Crimea. Powerful explosions rang out in several districts, and the occupiers complain in local Telegram channels that Crimea is allegedly being attacked with missiles. The network also reports on the work of Russian air defense. At about 7:40 a.m., the occupiers announced an air raid siren in Crimea. At first, the danger was only for Sevastopol, but it quickly spread to the entire peninsula. The Crimean Wind Telegram channel also wrote that a separate alarm was sounded in military units. Later, the occupiers reported in local Telegram channels that Crimea was allegedly being attacked with ATACMS missiles. As early as 7:45 a.m., local residents reported powerful explosions. First, they were heard in the Jankoy district. A few minutes later, it was loud in the Krasnogvardeyski and Krasnoperekopsky districts. In addition, the network writes that the so-called air defense of the invaders is allegedly working in Jankoy. It is interesting that thick smoke rises over the village of Novostepny after powerful explosions. As of 8:10, the all-clear sounded in Crimea. The so-called governor of Sevastopol, Mikhail Razvadjiv, has not yet commented in detail on these explosions in Crimea. But this is not all the disagreements that arise among the occupiers on the peninsula. This is what Yalta looks like this morning. After yesterday's downpour, the river brought mud, silt and even garbage to the sea. This is how Russians see resorts, recreation and, most importantly, care for Crimea. But if you think that they care at least a little about the environment, then absolutely not. The peninsula has every chance to roll back 100 years in climate and become a semi-desert, all because of the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. Vegetation cover in the previously irrigated areas of the southern and Kherson regions and Crimea decreased by 85%. Crimea also had an extremely dry winter this season, with only half of the normal precipitation and only 17% of the normal mountain precipitation. The rivers have dried up, and the reservoirs are already severely depleted. Crimea seems to be returning to its pre-Soviet state. Almost uninhabited areas, and most agriculture and even human housing may become impossible. It is predicted that about 500,000 people will be forced to leave these places. Of course, under Ukraine, the peninsula lived for itself, received tourists, at least somehow took care of the environment and attractions. Then the Russians came, plundered the peninsula, calling it liberation, and Crimea was liberated only from the international plane, ecology, plantations, and even from ancient monuments. After all, I will remind you that the occupiers also destroyed Chersonesos. Russian invaders destroyed an archaeological monument of world importance, the ruins of the ancient city of Chersonesos in Crimea. In its place, they built the so-called New Chersonesos Park, and in fact a huge palace with an area of 24,000 square meters. Due to capital construction, the opportunity to explore the archaeological monument in the future is completely lost. The new finds, which the Russians discovered during construction work, were taken to Russia. This was reported by Evelina Kravchenko, a senior researcher at the Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine.
As Evelina Kravchenko notes, a new city was actually built on the site of the archaeological site. The so-called historical and archaeological park overlaps old finds. Several excavated objects were moved and rebuilt in another city. The Russians did not know anything about the geological situation at this place, so they began to remove soil on the territory with ordinary excavators. Somehow, they dug up an ancient spring there, so everything was flooded, said Evelina Kravchenko.
And about the so-called international news in quotation marks, which the occupiers deserve. Zaporizhia Gauleiters visit Belarus. Didn't expect it? And they will come. Tomorrow, July 22nd, a trip of Gauleiters from the occupation administrations of the Zaporizhia region is scheduled in Belarus. The group will allegedly negotiate contracts between local seized enterprises and local manufacturers. This was reported by the Center of National Resistance. Next, I suggest listening in more detail.
Thus, according to the Kremlin's plan, this should legalize the occupation in the eyes of the international community. However, in fact, the Lukashenko regime is not recognized by the civilized world, and it is no secret that the country is currently actually occupied and has no sovereignty. The National Resistance Center notes that it is better for some Gauleiters not to return from Belarus, because in Ukraine they will only be logically punished for their crimes against the Ukrainian people.
I think that it will be easy for these war criminals, in principle, to get along. After all, some betrayed their country under the control of the occupiers, while others have already proclaimed himself president. In short, they have something in common. I remind you that Belarus has recently become more active in terms of Russian propaganda, while the local mouthpieces say that they are ready to negotiate but do not specify with whom and about what. Alexander Lukashenko, it seems, was only charged with the remnants of these narratives. Or he just wants to show his pseudo-importance. In short, let us remind ourselves what narratives about the so-called dialogue Lukashenko has recently spread.
It turns out that it is possible to come to an agreement, but it is necessary to talk. If there is no dialogue, if there is no talk, then there will only be escalation, and people will die. In Ukraine, there are enough normal people, especially among the military. The Russians are ready to sit down at the negotiating table and negotiate, discuss and negotiate. So far, NATO-backed Ukrainians are fighting to the last Ukrainian. It's a pity, but we need to talk. I think we will discuss everything at the meeting with Putin.
But that's not all the news from the Kremlin's henchmen. I also want to remind you that he is trying in some way to get some money and probably approval from Putin through the so-called business contracts. Because Ukraine warned Belarus about the consequences of signing agreements with the occupation authorities of Crimea, emphasizing that this is a demonstration of recognition of the Russian occupation of the Ukrainian peninsula. Deputy Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha wrote about this on Facebook. He claims that the Ukrainian side is aware of at least 7 agreements signed by the regions and cities of Belarus with the Gauleiter authorities in Crimea. For example, in June, the city of Vitebsk and the Vitebsk region concluded agreements, so-called, with the occupation authorities of the cities of the Ukrainian Crimea, Simferopol and Feodosia, as well as the Council of Ministers and the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of Crimea and the Saki district of the peninsula.
There is no doubt that such actions could not have taken place without the permission of the top leadership of the state. That is, all these agreements are a frank and documented demonstration of recognition of the Russian occupation by the Republic of Belarus. All facts of illegal actions that pose a threat to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine are clearly recorded by the law enforcement agencies of our state. An appropriate investigation is underway, as a result of which those involved will not go unpunished and will be brought to justice.
According to Andriy Sybiha, Ukraine has already taken appropriate measures to respond to these illegal actions. Officials involved in the preparation and signing of such documents in quotation marks will be the subject of consideration for the application of sanctions restrictions by partners from the sanctions coalition.